Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Michael Ard, Program Director for the Master's of Science Intelligence Analysis at Johns Hopkins Krieger School for Advanced Academic Programs. Today, we discuss what is the future of intelligence analysis? What do we need to do to compete and stay relevant and effective? How can education prepare us for this? And with us today, I'd like to welcome Joe Gartin, who will speak to this. Joe is a national security professional with more than 30 years of experience in the U.S. intelligence community. He recently retired from the CIA as Deputy Associate Director of CIA for Talent and Chief. He was Chief Learning Officer and overseeing the development of the global workforce. And congratulations, Joe, on your retirement. His previous assignments include Dean of the Sherman Kent School for Intelligence Analysis, Vice Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, and Director of the President's Daily Briefing. He began his career in 1986 at the predecessor of today's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Joe now is Managing Editor at the CIA's Journal for Studies in Intelligence. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks so much. I'm really honored to be with you today, and I look forward to the conversation. Let me make one sort of disclaimer up front. In Studies in Intelligence, the journal, which some of the viewers may have seen, there's always a caveat at the bottom of every single article that it says essentially, this is not the view of the US government, the CIA, and really it might not even be true. And that's where I'm coming from today. I'm representing myself rather than any government organization, obviously. I wanted to talk a little bit as maybe a sort of a preamble to our conversation today about intelligence analysis, and for those of your viewers who are interested, sort of the career of intelligence analysis and where I think it's going. And I'll start with an article that I wrote in 2019, actually published in Studies in Intelligence, available on the CIA website, in which I wanted to reflect on sort of my own career journey, but really more importantly, the journey of intelligence analysis as it's performed in the United States. And it struck me that I thought that there were sort of three phases for intelligence analysis. The first, it's really that sort of primary phase, the creation of the modern intelligence community in 1947 after the experiences of World War II. And these early efforts led by people like Sherman Kent, for whom the CIA schoolhouse is named, along with many others, to codify, to explain, to sort of create this architecture for what does it mean to be an intelligence analyst, and what is that craft all about, and what are the principles and the ethics and the sort of mores about intelligence analysis. And this sort of very sort of formative stage for intelligence analysis is really, really important. I think if there's a criticism that you could aim at it, and there are many probably, the chief one would be that it was also, in a sense, sort of simplistic, that Kent relied on really smart people who were a lot like him to read things and to write things. And that sounds sort of slightly pejorative, but it's not necessarily. In fact, it works most of the time because in most of our day-to-day lives, that kind of heuristic reasoning, what happened yesterday is probably going to happen tomorrow, works pretty well. Actually, it's how we get through our lives. From a national security standpoint, that actually can work pretty well most of the time, but there can be really significant faults. Most famously, I think, when Kent was leading the estimative intelligence efforts, the U.S. government published an NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate, that said the Soviets wouldn't put offensive missiles in Cuba. And of course, it's sort of fantastically wrong. What I always think is most interesting about that is not the being wrong part, but really the explanation that came later, because Kent argued for years that it wasn't a mistake. The Soviet Union had made a mistake, and you can't account for that kind of idiocy in your adversary. Of course, this is really just a self-justification of error, but it's one that he stuck to for a long time. And to me, it just highlighted that relying on really smart people to read a lot of things and to write a lot of things works a lot of the time, but it can also be sort of catastrophically incorrect. If you jump ahead to the, say, the 1980s and 1990s, I think you have this period of professionalization of intelligence analysis. And it's driven by multiple things. I think significantly driven by advances in cognitive science, understanding how people make decisions, the cognitive biases that we all carry that can interfere with good decision making and good analysis, therefore. It also accompanied, I think it was accompanied by the development of things like structured analytic techniques, which were designed, people hope, to sort of counteract the biases, these cognitive biases that got in the way of analysis. So you had this period, I think, in the 80s and 90s in which intelligence analysis became less of a craft of an elite group of individuals and more of an industry, really, with rules, ethics, and agreed upon approaches on how you should conduct analysis. This, I think, carried us well into the end of the 20th century. And then we had this other really significant inflection point, of course, with 9/11 and the Iraq War, and in particular, the failings around both of those from an intelligence standpoint. One, the well-documented failures in intelligence to understand the threat, the immediate threat that Al-Qaeda was posing, and to uncover plots and to cooperate across government agencies, to think imaginatively, as the 9/11 Commission articulated, about the challenges that we were facing. And with Iraq WMD, of course, there you have not so much a failure of imagination, but the failure to consider alternatives, groupthink that affected not only the US intelligence community, but every single one of our allies. These failures there certainly led to a reappraisal of intelligence as a craft, but also, and I'll just be very brief here, it also led to a real great expansion of intelligence analysis. So not only did you have the traditional let's read stuff and write stuff, and then efforts to improve that, you had, I think, this real splintering, or maybe specialization is a better term in terms of analysis. What is intelligence analysis? That means lots of different things today. It can be all the way from the strategic, which is really where I spend a lot of my time, the President's Daily Briefing and National Intelligence Estimates, all the way down to what is Michael Art's telephone number and where does he live, and who do we send to kick the door in? I mean, this is a pretty wide range of activities that now are lumped under intelligence analysis. And really, sort of maybe the last thing I'll say here, and then turn it over to Michael, is, so where does this take us? And I began to sort of think about, and certainly not unique in this aspect, think about how do things like big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, how do these tools influence the intelligence community and help it continue to transition from let's read stuff and write stuff to let's make actual data-driven analysis, and leveraging the tools that are available to us in ways that really most of you watching this are quite accustomed to today. The power of your cell phone in your pocket, or your laptop or your iPad or whatever, is extraordinary. It brings you a wealth of information and makes life a lot easier. From an intelligence standpoint, you need to figure out how to use those tools. As I sort of thought about it, I was really envisioning the idea that you would have this kind of digital assistant that helps you do your job better, that's able to process vastly greater amounts of information than a person can on a day-to-day basis, but it's still very much informed by the particular skill that a human being brings to it, which is that ability to recognize patterns and develop models for behavior, to think creatively, which computers, for the most part, can't generally do. So I think we're at a real inflection point. As I said, I started to say, if there's a criticism of my own approach, it's one I think that is common to all sort of forms of intelligence forecasting, which is really just predicting the present. So in 2019, the sort of future of a digital assistant seemed a little bit far-fetched, imaginable, but not yet attainable within the IC, certainly. Today, I think we're probably much closer. And then there is a rapid proliferation of tools, I think, particularly you see in the private sector, data visualization, geospatial tools, sort of, mass processing of unclassified information, like you see in companies like Bell and Cat, sort of the democratization of intelligence, meaning that lots of people can do what I used to do, what Michael used to do, which was exclusive to us, now is actually fairly commonplace. I expect that those trends will really continue. And I'm going to stop there, otherwise I'll use up too much time.
Thanks. I mean, that's thank you for that great introduction to this topic, Joe. And I would like to maybe start with speaking about, okay, so we democratization of intelligence. There's companies doing a lot of the same things that we used to think of traditional intelligence agencies as doing. And now there's analysts really all over the private sector, in corporate America, working for corporate America, working for the government. It looks to me like with all this, we're seeing an expansion of the need for intelligence analysts. We hope so. That's what we're here for, teaching, right? But in your article, you made an interesting point, was maybe the future with all this machine learning and AI and all these things available to us, we'll need fewer analysts. Do you still think that may be a possibility?
I think that all organizations, including even the government, as unlikely as it's sometimes seen, will make good resource decisions over time to try to balance what the demand signal is for their particular product. In our case, in the intelligence community, as you know, it's information and insight that gives the decision maker the space to act. That sort of demand signal against what do I need to achieve that demand. I do think that there are, in the government, we would say efficiencies to be gained that might mean that we need fewer analysts doing certain kinds of work. But I think your question, in a sense, sort of answers itself, because, like you, I'm on LinkedIn. And, while it might be maybe a counterintelligence nightmare, it's also a really great way to sort of see what is happening in the industry. And there are lots of organizations inside and outside government that need expertise, critical thinking, teamwork, excellent communication skills, excellent briefing skills, to help them do their job better. So I think, broadly speaking, you'll see a continued expansion of opportunities. I think there are going to be specific areas where you might say, I need fewer watch center analysts, right? Because I can use this machine learning, artificial intelligence tool to give me some sense making for what's happening in parts of the world that I don't want to watch intensively. But on the, sort of higher up the value chain, as in other industries, you'll have this requirement for people who have, as I said, these skills that, your program and others are trying to develop for the future workforce.
Right. I mean, one of the things that came out, as I was thinking about this topic, and I think we were exchanging emails on it, was an article that was written and published in Foreign Affairs in March this year by Zach Brown and Carmen Medina. And it was really, looking at, okay, what's the value added for the government agencies now? There's, with so much available open source, so much available to the public, and do we need a more open architecture and draw back a lot on kind of our secrecy requirements and on this, and her argument and Zach's argument basically is to stay, to stay relevant. Is that, what do you think of that argument?
First of all, I should say I know Carmen and Zach well, and admire their work and admire the sort of way that they, and I think some others, are trying to sort of push the thinking on this particular topic. I have a couple of reactions to it. The one is that I think one of the aspects, certainly in my 35 years in your time in the IC, that we always saw is that the intelligence community, the U.S. intelligence community agencies, are really service organizations, and they're highly customer focused. And they don't pick and choose what they want to work on. They work on the priorities of an administration, and they're responsive to those priorities. And I used to say, on the PDB staff, President's Daily Briefing staff, if it's Christmas Eve and you need to write a PDB, you'll call an analyst and they'll come in and write it for the next day. If I have to reach out to the private sector, they can say yes or no, right? I mean, they have a choice about how to use their resources. So this service mindset, and this is something that I think that Greg Treverton, who was the chairman of the NIC when I was there as vice chairman, he always liked the term client. He thought of the IC as having clients, not customers, that we were in the client service business, and I think that's a good model. So on the one hand, you've got this really strong DNA towards service and providing information and being responsive and being relevant that I think can be a distinguishing factor that keeps the policymaker engaged. The second is the need for privacy. I mean, we could say secrecy, but let's just sort of step back a little bit and say that all decision makers, regardless of the nature of their job, need private ways of gaining information that, as I said, I'm borrowing here from Director Hayden, about giving policymakers the space, the time, the sort of temporal space, physical space, the information space to make good decisions. And this is an area where I think, again, there are some activities certainly that we can see migrating into the open source world. Principally, this is an argument that Amy Ziegart and others have made too, and I get that. But I also think that client relationship and that need for secret and inside information will be continuing. The last point I think is always relevant to this conversation. And this is where I think Carmen and Zach probably should consider their next article, is that the enemy always gets a vote, right? The enemy gets a vote. So the open source world that we see today isn't a permanent state. And every time that we identify something, in the open source world that an adversary might be doing, the adversary can take an action to prevent its discovery the next time. And so I think that there's an action-reaction cycle here that's really important to consider as you try to forecast the future of intelligence.
One of the things that, and thanks for that answer. And again, we invite everybody to join us with your questions in the chat, which we'd like to get to very soon. I won't ask all the questions. I hope I don't have to ask all the questions, but I'm ready. One thing I was thinking about, and what part of the challenge of this, and I was empathetic, let's put it that way, to the analysts who had to figure out what was going on prior to January 6th, right? And dealing with a deluge of social media information, trying to figure it out. In some ways, I thought, in this new environment, in some ways, it's getting more difficult to actually feel what the real trend lines are in situations like that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, January 6th to me illustrates a particular challenge. First of all, it's not a foreign intelligence issue. So, from a foreign intelligence community-based standpoint, it's not something that the IC would generally cover. But let's step back broadly and think about it as a sort of broad intelligence problem that you're getting at. One is that you really need good sort of sentiment sensing tools to help you deal with the vast quantities of information that are publicly available. Two, I think you need to develop and continuously improve strong models for understanding how groups behave. I think you have to bear in mind that, as you know very well, that oftentimes actors themselves have not decided to do something until they do it.
That's right.
Right. That there's a phenomenon here that makes predicting when there might be unrest in Tunisia a particular challenge, in the early days, in the pre-Arab Spring days, because the fruit vendor hasn't decided to publicly commit suicide until that particular moment. And so what you can say is that you see certain kind of circumstances emerging, evolving, that given the right spark and then the right fuel could result in a range of options, a range of activities. I'm not saying it sounds vague, but I think it just highlights the difficulty that the intelligence community, broadly speaking, has always faced trying to assess social movements when the actors themselves haven't decided on the course of their action. So you step back a little bit, I think, and focus kind of on that client relationship again, which is to say, I see this broad situation evolving. Here are the triggers that I'm worried about. Here are the milestones that would tell me it's going in one direction or the other. Here's what you might do about it. Here's how it could get out of control.
One thing that you raised in the article, the analysts of the future, where you're trying to think ahead, was the importance of giving all this information, theory, and context, right? So this gets to the question of, okay, what kind of analysts do we need to recruit, right? Let's speak a little bit about that. So what has this changed any? Are we still looking for the same type of person to be an intelligence analyst, or is this changed with the new technology environment?
Well, I think this is a tough question, or maybe a sort of a tough problem, not a tough question, for lots of reasons. One is that you think about how slowly does any organization, including the intelligence community, actually change its workforce. And so if you just sort of consider, generally speaking, that the government hires small numbers of employees every year, in a sense, you're dancing with the one who brung you, right? I mean, the workforce that you have today is the workforce of the future, for the most part. As you look to recruit, to me, I have a couple of sort of maybe broad categories. One is it's really this emphasis on creativity, teamwork, critical thinking, communication skills, curiosity, continuous learning, right? These are the things I think when you look back on your career and I look back on my career, the people around you that you always were excited to work with them, it's because they were curious, because they were critical thinking, because they questioned your assumptions and their own assumptions. The second broad category, of course, is our experts. I mean, you need people who know a lot about something. That can sort of be deep, functional, regional, country expertise, or it can be cross-cutting expertise. It can be scientific expertise. So, and I think that we're going to continue as an organization to look for those people. I think maybe where the leavening agent comes in, if I can use that expression, is finding those individuals who maybe they're a French major and a history major, but they've worked on some projects in which they analyze data, right? That they've leveraged tools to help them assess, a large quantity of open source material. There are people who can partner well across organizational lines to say, hey, I have this hard problem. Let me come to you, data scientist, and ask you some questions that maybe help me solve it. So, I think that look, there's always going to be a market in my mind for the smart generalist and the smart expert. The kind of student that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. For sure, there's a future there. The opportunity, I think, comes in this melding, blending of skills and expertise and abilities that can really tackle these hardest problems that need to go beyond just read stuff, write stuff.
I'd like to get to a few questions in the chat now. Bob asks, talking about the responsibilities of analysts and how they should be driving collection. And he was a longtime analyst. He believes that senior analysts should be spending 50% of their time working on collection issues. I think that's an interesting point. Is that a view you'd share?
I certainly think that analysts need to be driving collection. I mean, I would agree with Bob wholeheartedly in that sense. I don't know if I could assign a percentage to it, but I think that you need to have people who are smart enough on a topic and an issue to say, I know a lot, but now I realize that there are things I don't know. I'm missing data on X, Y, and Z that I really, really need to help me solve a problem here. I think this kind of collaboration between what used to be fairly stovepiped organizations, and it wasn't long before I joined the agency, when you couldn't go into certain parts of CIA headquarters, right, if you didn't have the right kind of badge, and we had separate cafeterias. Those days seem archaic, as probably they should in today's environment, but you still have these sort of stovepipes between elements of any intelligence community organization. And it's really important to break those down and to have really, really good partnerships between the people who have questions and the people who can get you the answers. Right.
I think, thanks for that. Another Barbara makes a statement, but I think there's an interesting follow-up to this. She says, it's very difficult to predict the moment when an individual will take the plunge and commit violence, right? I think we're kind of looking at that from the situation back in January, but also, I mean, her experience with working terrorism issues, that's always been, frankly, a mystery in our profession, right? When does somebody go from just being a sympathizer to something to actually taking that plunge and to violence? It seems to me, maybe perhaps this is going too far, but sometimes we're asked to make that call, right, on when this mystery is going to take place. I think the community was asked to do that, like, for example, with the fall of the government Capitol. When is that mystery going to happen, right? And then it becomes something of considered a failure when something there's really not even a good theory on happens. And what do you think in your career? What have you any thoughts on that? And how do we sort of explain that to our clients?
It's easy to say and hard to execute, as I think you probably have experienced. But sometimes you just have to stick with, I don't know. I don't know the answer here.
Right.
But let me reframe your question. Let me reframe your question, Mr. Policymaker, Mrs. Policymaker, to tell you what I do know and tell you the things that I should be looking for, tell you the gaps that we might have that really would affect our judgment. We spent a lot of time, I think, as you know, and it's certainly publicly available, thinking about assumptions when we were writing NIEs. What are the key assumptions that are baked into our analysis? That kind of key assumptions check is a really, fundamental piece, I think, of reducing that cone of uncertainty that a policymaker is dealing with, from a highly expansive cone, maybe down to a little bit more narrow. And you can do that in a way, I think, often without giving someone giving that client, that customer, a concrete prediction that X is going to happen on Y date. Rather, you can say, here are the circumstances that might lead to X, and it could occur within this time frame. And as we get out farther in the time frame, we're less certain about our predictions. I mean, this is essentially the art of the long view, and
right.
understanding that certainty reduces with time. and making sure you're conveying that. And I think the hardest, those hardest moments that you have as an intelligence analyst are always, never about really sort of being right or wrong. I've been right and I've been wrong plenty of times. It's more when you should have been uncertain, and yet you were certain about what would happen, right? It's a little bit different than saying, I think X is going to happen, and there was some variable. Instead, you should have thought about, let me tell you about the variables that I don't know the answers to here, and really focus on that analytic tradecraft piece. Keeps you out of trouble.
We're often, though, asked to sharpen our judgments. So we have and then we're trying to sharpen your judgment, and yet hedging for uncertainty. It makes for a little bit of a tension there.
Yes, for sure. And I'm not sure I can offer a really good solution to that. It's sometimes it's case by case, but I think also that there are some sort of fundamental intelligence tradecraft principles that you sometimes really have to stick with.
There's some more interesting questions in the chat. Do you think an over-reliance on AI has the potential to weaken the IC's culture of personal accountability for wrong calls? If a report is based on a bad software output, where does the accountability fall?
That's such a great question. I think it's a really powerful question that probably will require us in the future a fair amount of self-examination about how you do business, about how you use artificial intelligence and other tools. I think that the good thing is we won't be alone in this problem. I think that this is one that will affect a lot of industries. Medical diagnoses would be a good example, where you could, seed, decision making to an artificial intelligence tool to tell you, is this, is something on this image, is that a bad thing or, or a benign thing? You need that intervention of a human being, I think, not only to provide expertise, but also to provide that accountability. The other piece, and certainly not alone in observing this, and I imagine that that the person asking the question has this in mind too. It does require, and this kind of gets back to your question about the analyst of the future. It doesn't mean that analyst needs to be able to write code necessarily. I certainly can't. But it does mean that the analyst needs to be able to ask some really good questions about the person who wrote that model that they're relying on, and really being able to sort of unpack and understand, where is the risk of a bias entering into this? When I thought I was using a tool to eliminate bias, as it turns out, and we have lots and lots of examples about this in artificial intelligence in its early years here, where bias is in fact baked into algorithms. I don't think there'll be a reduction in personal accountability. I think I feel that is sort of an essential element for the intelligence community, but it will require probably a different approach to understanding data.
Another question here on open sources. Would you describe what we see as sort of the tip of the iceberg? This viewer says, I've been looking at Hezbollah activities in Latin America. I feel as though what I see in open sources are probably only a tiny piece of the large picture. I think this gets back to really, there's still a big role for clandestine collection, right? On something like that, you can't get it just from open source, of course.
No,
go ahead.
Absolutely. No, I was going to say absolutely right. I mean, I'm not sure I can build on your response more than that. It highlights to me the need for, again, deep expertise, deep regional, functional, cross-functional, cross-regional expertise. It highlights the need for multiplicity of sources. Yes, open source can be really, really powerful and really, really important. It provides you lots and lots of data to work with to help you sort of assess sentiment and spot trends. But it also comes down, I think, sometimes to being able to ask a particular decision maker, a particular influencer, and really, what are they doing, and identifying them.
Well, I mean, going hand in hand with open source has been that we all also have access to more clandestine communications ourselves. So I mean, you know, we're if your target is, say, a Hezbollah operative in Latin America, I mean, your problem with that is that they're probably not announcing their presence on social media. So we don't. It doesn't really help us there. And we still have a big role for human intelligence on things like that. I don't think that's going to go away. Another question is, can analysts predict black swan moments where such, for example, the Tunisian example, which seemed utterly unpredictable? We have a few questions that are along those lines with respect to AI too.
I think the short answer is, well, the short answer might be, if they're a black swan, then no, we can't predict them. Let me say that I'll say maybe, you know, maybe they're gray swans, whatever the right analogy might be. If you look back, I think at the Arab Spring and ask some questions about how did we assess the stability of certain regimes? How well did we understand sort of attitudes on the street? How well did we understand what regimes would do in the face of unrest? How well did we understand the ability for communities to coalesce and mobilize? You know, there, I think those are the ways that you approach that particular problem. I also think that, you know, as in you know, the National Intelligence Council, the Global Trends reports come out every 4 years, and sort of similar efforts that are done by Atlantic Council and others that try to take a look at really significant current drivers as well as long range trends, and then consider, you know, what are those events that are, if they're not entirely foreseeable, you know, certainly we can anticipate that they are real things that could in fact happen. It's a little bit short of saying, you know, let's worry about meteor strikes, for example. Right. But you can say, as you know, we have said for many years, inside and outside the intelligence community, that eventually there will be a global pandemic. You know, that's likely to result, you know, from some disease jumping from animals to human, and if we don't react promptly, it will go from an outbreak to an epidemic to a pandemic. I mean, it's not a black swan necessarily, because you can sort of predict it. What you don't know is the specific timing, because it's not a knowable thing.
One related to that is, do you think that AI and machine learning perhaps gravitates more toward the common results rather than black swan? Could this be getting us thinking more down, you know, thinking more down the middle rather than those inflection points?
You know, I certainly think that's a risk, and I certainly hope it's not the case. I mean, and I realize there's a tension in what I just said there, where, you know, I really see the value of these emerging capabilities, these emerging tools, is to do just that. It's to just spot that one thing that pops up that is in fact outside of the ordinary, which says, there's, you know, somebody who got sick in Wuhan last week.
Yeah.
Now there are 2 people sick, and can we spot that faster? You know, I think an example that I often think about is, could you conceal the Manhattan atomic bomb project today, right? And think about what were the tools that you would have to detect it. And you know, one of which, of course, as the Soviets used against us, is just old-fashioned plain espionage.
Right.
But you would have access to data, I think, that would tell you, hey, that's really interesting because Michael just went from Washington, D.C. to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then to Chicago. And nobody ever flies from Washington, D.C. to Oak Ridge to Chicago and back to D.C. That is weird, right? So really smart people can sometimes spot those things, but really smart machines, I think, can spot them faster.
I mean, to me, a lot of this is pointing to something of a very exciting new age where we're facing. I think it would be a very exciting time, I think, to go into intelligence analysis with all what that's available to us. So let's get to a couple of questions on that. One is, and this is more a specific question. Perhaps you have the answer to. Do you know anything about the prohibition on hiring former Peace Corps volunteers into the intelligence community? I know a little bit about it myself, but perhaps you have a broader understanding of where the agencies are on that.
My understanding, and I know a couple of people who were in the Peace Corps and then were in the intelligence community. So yes, you can go from one to the other. There's typically an air gap, and I don't remember what that is anymore, but I imagine it's on the order of several years. Principally to protect those in the Peace Corps from association with the intelligence community. So yes, that experience that you gain overseas in the Peace Corps can translate into intelligence careers later. But as I said, there is an air gap meant to protect the State Department.
Another question on how could someone improve, say, a foreign national from a country that's an ally of the U.S. prove his or her analyst skills through learning programs in academia or institutions in the U.S. Well, I mean, we're doing that, right? We have a number of programs like that in the U.S. now, Mark, and I think that there's some programs also, Mark, that are quite affordable. There's also other programs that cost more. But that's been a growth area in the U.S. I welcome you to take a look at a lot of the programs that are out there, and hopefully you find something that fits for you. Another question is, what advice, Joe, would you give a new analyst just beginning their career in government?
Oh gosh, that's a really great question. I always felt that, and continue to feel that, a career in government not only is an honorable thing, but it is a career filled with opportunity. I was talking to someone, a young officer recently, and said, "Look, I never looked out the same window for more than a couple of years." That although it can be sort of daunting, and maybe in today's economy not a necessarily a traditional approach to say, "Well, I want to go work somewhere for 30 or 35 years." In fact, what you're really saying is, I want to work and do an interesting job for a couple of years and maybe find another interesting job and another interesting job. I found the intelligence community generally, as I said, to be a place of opportunity, in particular for those individuals who will say yes. When the organization says, "Hey, I need you to move from this account to work on that account. I need you to go brief this person. I need you to take this trip. I need you to serve in a war zone." Thinking about what the organization needs, of course, and as well as the individual, everybody has to make their own decisions about what they want to do. But gosh, there's just such an array of opportunities and variety of jobs within the intelligence community, and then broadly speaking, the national security community. And then even more, if you just cast that net wider to say the private sector analytic intelligence, community, if you can call it that, all those people from Disney to Walmart, who are looking for smart people to help them understand risk to their programs, risk to their clients, their customers, their facilities. There are, I think, sort of endless opportunities for people who are interested in intelligence. And I think I would say, the last point there, and at risk of going on too long, Michael, when I do talk to people who are interested in intelligence careers and they tell me I'm applying to the CIA, and I'll say, yes, but do you know that there's a Defense Intelligence Agency and NGA and NSA and Treasury and State Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Think broadly, explore broadly, and be open to the opportunities that are out there.
One of the great, I mean, I think one of the big benefits of the reforms for 2004 is it basically forced the community to work together, but also to do rotations. And I benefited from 2 rotations myself. Some of the highlights of my career was spent there, even though I was a CIA employee, but it really gave me a broadening experience, and I became a much better analyst. And I must say, you know, I eventually went to become a private sector analyst, and I said, boy, I wish I could go back and use these skills that I've acquired in the private sector now back in the government, because I think I would be even more effective. But maybe we can do that in the future.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something there, and you're actually reminding me about something else. So let me just get to that point, which is, I think the ability to move in and out of the intelligence community in the future is probably the most important innovation we can make, that allows somebody to say, I want to work at the CIA for a few years, and then I want to go work at Amazon. And when I come back, I'm going to go work at the Defense Intelligence Agency. But then I think I'm going to go work at Disney. That ability to move in and out of the IC, which is not a traditional approach for the government writ large, and particularly not in the intelligence community, would be really important. We haven't touched on foreign language, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I think that foreign language is an absolutely essential skill for many, not all, but for many intelligence officers. And I probably can't stress enough that I think that can be a really important tool for entering the IC. It distinguishes one candidate from another often, because along with foreign language ability comes cultural understanding, insight, the ability to consume media in another language. I could go on there. Really, really important. And if you've got a facility for it, if you've got an ability to learn a foreign language, by all means, I would do that.
It helps defeat, I mean, for a lot of our probably listeners now, and I get this from our students a lot, defeat the whole mirror imaging problem that we have as, of course, Americans. We have a certain view of the world, but if you spend some time abroad, you should, if you're thinking of a career in intelligence analysis. Very important to have a tacit understanding of the countries we're looking at. And this will be I just want to segue into something there. And Dan, I want to get to your question. I was just out of the flow a little bit. It's a little different. But so this gets us to the idea of strategic intelligence, right? A lot of, for example, our students have a very strong background, operational, tactical intelligence, but they ask me, we'd like to understand more about strategic intelligence. They see it, I think I see it, that the current priorities of the United States are really sort of geared toward strengthening our strategic intelligence. Since that has a big part of your background, Joe, any thoughts on that and what we need to do?
Well, I would agree, I guess, entirely with the premise of the question. For me, as you said, I spent a lot of time in that sort of strategic analytic space, and particularly on the National Intelligence Council, where I think one caveat I sometimes will attach to the idea of strategic analysis is that I think there's a tendency to think about strategic as long-term, but that's temporal.
Right.
When I think of strategic analysis, I think it can be that, but I also think about impact. And sometimes it's sort of the amplitude, right? It's the degree of impact that you have. So strategic analysis can be, understanding that there's a risk that bin Laden maybe is in Pakistan and not in Afghanistan, and finding them. That's pretty darn strategic. If your goal as a government is to defeat Al-Qaeda. So it doesn't always have to mean temporal, and it doesn't have to mean really long-term, really strategic 25 year forecasts. And the reason for that, as you very well know, and many of your audience members have probably experienced firsthand, is that, gosh, most policymakers can't think in those terms. They don't get elected for 20-year terms. They don't get assigned, appointed to be a secretary, undersecretary, deputy secretary for 25 years. They're there for 2 years or 1 year, sometimes shorter. 4 years if you're president, maybe 8. So their horizons are much shorter. And sometimes strategic can really mean helping them make really good decisions that affect the next 2 or 3 years, while at the same time stepping back and taking that long-term view, as I think we do need to do, when we're talking about the challenges from sort of transnational issues like climate change or disease, or various sort of proximate strategic issues like China and Russia. So you do need that long view. You need to think about strategic drivers, but you also need to bear in mind that the policymakers, they're dealing with the principals committee meeting tomorrow to make a decision about what they're going to do next week.
By the way, let me mention to our audience that, and you've used the phrase a couple of times, the long view, and the book by Peter Schwartz, which I know we used to, was taught in the Sherman Kent School. And it was a book that I got a lot out of. And if you're an intelligence analyst or an aspiring one, it's a book you should read and study with a lot of attention. It's done a lot, and certainly it's not just critical thinking, but creative thinking that we need to be good analysts. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and want to honor my pledge of getting to all the questions. So these may come in random order. Okay, from Dan. Assuming that the majority of intelligence-related adversarial information operations, IO, is informed by OSINT, who in the IC would you recommend be the lead agency for delivering intelligence related to IO, information operation? Some agencies have pushed the buck back to IO planners, but I disagree with this approach. Do you have a take on that?
I think the answer for me would be, and this is not an area of deep expertise for me, Dan, so so bear that in mind certainly. But I think I would come to the view that you probably need a multiplicity of agencies, and by that I don't mean giant agencies, but I mean producing organizations that meet the requirements that are specific to the customer. So that sounds kind of bureaucratic, but I think what I really mean to say in plain English is that a Defense Department requirement to understand information operations are different than the Bureau's information operations requirements, which are different than, the CIA's requirements. So I don't think that there's a one-stop solution here. Where I do think this and so many other domains is necessary to have really good enterprise abilities to gather, collect, analyze, and disseminate information. Those I think should be, as to the extent possible, they should be enterprise. But you need organizations that are tailored to their unique clients' requirements, I think.
I'm typing the book in the chat, okay? Peter Schwartz, right? Few people asked.
Oh, I've got it behind. I've got it on my bookshelf behind me. Yeah, I do. Matter of fact, of course.
It's a book that probably could have been done in several editions, right? But some of the examples might seem old to you, but I still find it to be very exciting to read, and I go back to it often. What advice would you give to a new but older intelligence analyst embarking on a second career, relating to that inflection point that you earlier described?
Well, the one thing I would say is that you're not alone. I mean, I used to meet with, when I was head of the Kent School, the CIA's training program, which has programs for new analysts as well, experienced analysts. In the agency's introductory program, you'd see a wide range in terms of ages and experiences. So you're not alone. That kind of hiring mid-career, quartile career, or sometimes late career is more common than people, I think, might actually appreciate outside the intelligence community. So the advice probably maybe sounds a little bit too straightforward, but I think it's leverage the expertise that got you in the door. Right? You got hired for a reason. Leverage that expertise. And 2, be open to the expertise of those people who are already there. And sometimes certainly in my experience as I've gotten older too, those are going to be analysts, maybe with, analysts or officers with far fewer years of experience than I do, than I have. But remember, why you got hired, why you got in the door is because you're an expert on a topic. And then once you're in the organization, be a good team player.
But you can't emphasize that enough, especially in this environment now. And something we always, you mentioned be able to be collaborative, very important. And finally, we have a question on what would you consider a key worry for an analyst today, in terms of being ready for this sort of future environment?
I'll come back maybe to a point that could have touched on at the very beginning, and just simply say that when I started as an analyst, when Michael started as an analyst, the way I consumed information at home was just like the way I consumed information at work, right? That there was a newspaper on the door, and when I went into work, we routed around paper folders full of traffic, that went from one desk to the other. Often traffic disappeared along the way. You never saw a particular report. It was in hard copy. What you produced was in hard copy. It was a very analog world. And today, the way that I consume information at home, the way that we're having this conversation right now on Zoom, on our mobile devices, it's different than the way you have to operate within a secure environment. That, to me, is the challenge, that it's finding a way to sort of narrow that gap between the way you consume information, exploit information at home or in your life versus the way you do it on your job. And as we all know, that phone has a lot more computing power than all the computers that put NASA rockets into space during the Apollo program. We know that, right? So that's the issue for me. It's finding a way to bridge that gap and make technology as seamless and as powerful at work as it is at home.
Yeah, thanks for that. And that's I think that's all the questions we have. And that book, again, a lot of people want to read that book. And Peter Schwartz, Art of the Long View. We should get to Sherman Kent's book on strategic intelligence while you're at it. It's a good read. We assign chapters of it in our class, and you might be the first person walking through the door of your agency to have actually said, I read Sherman Kent's book. It deserves to be read. I'd like to thank Joe Gartin for being here with us today. Congratulations, Joe, on your great career. Congratulations now on your next career, what you're doing. And we look forward to having you back. And I also like to say that our next program in December, we'll be looking at, is the Middle East primed for new thinking? So look out for invitations for that. We'll look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you.